conditions to help inform policy decisions. She's a member of the state of Maine's Revenue Forecasting Committee and serves the governor's liaison to the U.S. Census Bureau. She started working for the state in 2004 and has been the state economist since 2011. She got her bachelor's degree in economics from Wellesley and her master's in public policy and management from the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. She's originally from Camden and now lives in Union with her husband and two children. She lives just down the road from our very own Bruce Cobb, who is currently somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. So, Amanda, thank you.
Right, thank you. Good afternoon. Let me adjust this here. Okay. So we're recording. Got it. Got it. I'm going to bring up my slides here. And once everything is going, we'll be in good shape here. Share. Okay. Here we go. Yes. Good. Good? No. Well, hopefully that screen will go away. All right. I am going to, did I move something that shouldn't have moved? Yes. Yep. I was gonna say, and there's the little box there. Yep. And I think I may have moved that down by mistake. It seems to be just covering more. There we go. Okay, good. We're squared away now. I won't touch anything else on the screen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a lot of fun for me to come. I know a lot of folks in the audience already. I grew up just up the street on Pearl Street, and my parents still go to the church here. So it's a nice sort of friendly homecoming kind of feel for the presentation today. I'm going to talk about demographic and economic conditions in Maine. I'm going to start out, I got to get back on. There we go. I'm going to start out talking about demographics. It's really important if you're talking about the economy to understand who is living in an area making the decisions that make the economy go. So I always like to start out talking about demographics. This is sort of very big picture, talking about the state as a whole. The 2020 decennial population for the state, 1,362,359 people living in the state. We are the 42nd largest state in the US. We had a pretty slow population increase from 2010 to 2020. Population grew just 2.6%. That was actually also 42nd. And then the pandemic happened and Maine became a very popular place to be. And so we saw a lot more people moving into Maine during the pandemic. So we saw a very strong increase in 2021 and a slightly smaller, but still rather robust increase in 2022. So from 2020 to 2022, cumulatively, our population grew 1.7%. That was 14th in the US. So a big acceleration in growth. All of our population growth comes from migration. We've had natural population decline, which is more deaths than births each year, since 2011. Totally unrelated to the fact that that's the year I became state economist. Just a coincidence. So if you look at the chart, you'll see that there's sort of a little sliver in there that's light blue. That is international migration. That is people who move directly to Maine from other parts of the world. It's positive. It's relatively small. It was a little bit larger in 22 than it was in 21. The majority of our migration into the state is coming from that darker blue section up at the top there, which is domestic migration, people moving to Maine from other parts of the US. I'll point out that if somebody has moved from another part of the world to a different part of the US and then on to Maine, they end up in the domestic migration category. So we've had more than enough migration to offset that natural decline. So we have overall population growth. We grew about 13,700 in 2021, about 8,100 in 2022. If you look around the state, all of the different counties in the state saw both positive population growth and positive net migration. Maine was one of only 3 states in the country where that was the case, where all of our counties saw positive growth and positive net migration in 2022. Some of those with the more robust rates of in-migration and population growth are over on the left-hand side there. Those are some of the more rural counties, Piscataquis, Oxford, Washington. I will point out that Piscataquis County is also our smallest population-wise, so it does not take a lot of people moving in to see a big rate increase. But they still saw about 400 people moving in. That is significant for some of those really rural communities. It's noticeable. Knox County, actually all the way over on the right here, had the lowest of the net change in population, but it was still growth. All of this migration into the state had a big impact on the housing market. So even before the pandemic, we had seen the available supply of housing, the active listings, declining over time. And then we saw a lot more demand for housing as people were moving in, very, very limited supply, which of course, Econ 101 drove up prices. And so as we saw prices increase, we saw the affordability of homeownership become more limited. So this is from 2020. If you look, so before all of that migration into the state really picked up, and there were only a handful of counties that were considered affordable. I've color coded them here. So the ones that are green up at the top were considered affordable, and the ones in red are considered unaffordable. And you'll notice most of the affordable ones are some of the more rural counties. So Aroostook County, Piscataquis County, Somerset. If you look down towards the bottom, you'll notice Knox, Cumberland, Lincoln, some of the least affordable. If you move ahead to 2021 and see what happened after we started to see that influx of people coming in and house prices begin to rise, there were only 2 counties that were still considered affordable. And if you look at 2022, there are no counties that are affordable. And in fact, the least affordable counties here, so York, Lincoln, Knox, around 80% of households are unable to afford the median home price in the county. I will say on the housing market front, the good news is that everybody seems to have recognized that this is a challenge. And so there are a lot of people who are putting a lot of effort and substantial dollars into trying to come up with some solutions for this. It is not easy to come up with solutions for the housing market. There are a lot of very sort of local zoning related issues. There are workforce related issues in terms of just finding people to build more houses. Construction materials are very expensive. There are a lot of moving pieces, and it takes time, but at least everybody is sort of moving in the same direction on this at this point. So I want to talk a little bit about racial and ethnic diversity in the state. This is a map showing the diversity index for the different counties. So the diversity index basically says if you're taking 2 people at random from the population, what are the chances that they come from different racial or ethnic backgrounds? So in 2020, Maine's diversity index 18.5, the US 61.1. So we are the least diverse state by quite a bit. We're quite a bit lower than the US, but there is some regional variation. So Cumberland County, Androscoggin County, and Washington County are the more diverse counties that we have in the state. But all of the counties have some degree of diversity. I want to make sure to highlight that. Lincoln County is lowest. It's about 6% of the population comes from a race or ethnicity other than white non-Hispanic. So what I've done in the chart is I've taken out the white non-Hispanic population and given you all of the other categories so you can see the variation a little bit more clearly. So for those more diverse counties, you can see Androscoggin County has a larger share of the Black or African American population. Cumberland County does as well, and also has a larger share of the Asian population. Washington County, of course, has a larger share of the American Indian indigenous population. Washington County is sometimes surprising to people as a more diverse county in the state, but that population is the primary reason why. If we talk about age, we've talked for many years now about the fact that Maine is the oldest state. We have the highest median age. We have the highest percent of the population age 65 and over. But with all of that inflow of people coming into Maine during the pandemic, we actually saw our median age decline from 2020 to 2021. We were one of only 2 states where that happened. And then from 21 to 22, we held steady along with a few other states, and everybody else saw an increase in their median age. So that was because we had more people moving in who were below the age of 45, basically. We had a younger population that was moving into the state during the pandemic. So our statewide median, 44.8 years. You can see there are a few counties that are below the statewide median. Androscoggin County, Cumberland County, Penobscot, Kennebec a little bit under, York County's a little bit over, as is Franklin County. So those counties have a couple things going on. They have our more urban populations. We don't have really big cities here, but we have slightly more urban areas. And we also have, those counties also have higher college and university populations. And so those two things bring in enough young people to offset that baby boom generation. Oh, I would point out, so the two counties that have the highest median age, with a median age over 50 years, are Lincoln County and Piscataquis County. Knox is third in line, just a little bit below that 50-year mark. The younger generations in the state are also more diverse. And so there is a bit of a change that is going to be happening over time as we see the population age changing. So if you look at the top there, that's the diversity index for the state as a whole. That's that 18.5 I mentioned earlier. And you can see just below that is 65 to 84. You can see the diversity index there is just 7.9. But if you look down at the younger age cohorts, down at the bottom, under 5 years, 5 to 17 years, around 30. So it's still quite a bit lower than the US, but it's considerably more diverse than the state as a whole and than those older age cohorts. So why do we have the highest median age and the highest population over age 65? Well, we also have the highest share of our population that is in the baby boom generation. So the baby boom generation happened between 1946 and 1964. This is a population pyramid for Maine from 1950. So each one of those bars represents a percent of the population in a different age sex cohort. So 1950, baby boomers were just starting to be born. They were all under the age of 5 at the time. So the base of this pyramid is very wide. Up at the top, not a lot of people living beyond the age of 85 back in 1950. So it's very narrow. It's shaped roughly like a pyramid. That's where the name comes from. If you go ahead through a few decades, though, you can watch as that bulge of the baby boomers in the generation here moves up through the age cohorts. So we haven't had the migration into the state over the decades of younger generations to offset the aging of that baby boom cohort. So in 2022, baby boom generation between the ages of 58 and 76. If we look ahead to 2030, not that far off, baby boom generation between the ages of 66 and 84. So pretty solidly into traditional retirement ages. And the population pyramid here is looking a little bit upside down as that generation is accumulating up in the highest age cohorts here. If we compare, so these are slightly different age cohorts, which is why the picture looks a little bit different. Some of the upper ones are collapsed in the statewide. So Maine on the left, Knox County on the right. You can see, remember, Knox County had the third highest median age in the state. Also, you can see that sort of larger bulge up near the top of the population pyramid. These come from our population projections that my office does. We do them every couple of years, so it's based on recent trends. We try to capture whatever the most recent information is when we do them. These are from this year, so it'll be a couple of years before we update them again. But you can find them on our website, and we have these really nifty, this is literally just a screenshot from our website. You can go and you can play with the population pyramids on the website, see all the different counties, see different years of the age breakdown. So if you're interested, plug for my website, go check it out. So, of course, all of the demographics that we have in the state have a really big impact on our available workforce. So I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to talk about workforce and employment next. So this is the total civilian labor force for Maine. Goes all the way back to 1947 in this particular chart. So the first thing you'll notice is this really rapid period of increase that took place from mid 60s or so through to about 1990. So what was going on? Well, we had baby boomers aging into their prime working years. we had pretty good migration into the state, primarily of baby boomers, and we had women joining the labor force in much larger numbers than they had previously. So this was almost sort of a perfect storm of pretty rapid labor force growth during this period. And then it slowed. It was still growing, but growing slower, and then plateaued. And actually, more recently, now we've seen the labor force start to trend down as the baby boomers are moving into those traditional retirement ages. There's been a lot of talk since the pandemic about why our overall labor force participation rate is lower than that of the US. We'd been pretty close to the US pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, labor force participation rates dropped across the board. The US has pretty much recovered, Maine has not. And everybody wants to know why. Where are the workers? Why is the labor force participation rate lower? Well, if you look across the different age cohorts, we actually look pretty much like the US. Maine's in blue, the US is in orange. Not a lot of variation except for the 16 to 24 age cohort. We actually do better than the US in terms of labor force participation among the youngest workers here. The difference is that we have more of our population in those upper age cohorts where the labor force participation rate is lower. So because we have that concentration of population in the 55 to 64 and 65 plus age cohorts, our overall labor force participation rate has come down. If our demographics looked like those of the US, so if our age cohort population was the same as the US and these labor force participation rates were the same, our overall labor force participation rate would be the same as the US. It really is this demographic shift that is causing that decline in the labor force. At the same time that we have this declining labor force, we have a very, very low unemployment rate. So October's unemployment rate for the state was 2.8%. That's very close to record lows that it was at earlier this year. It's come up just a little bit. That's actually really good news because the reason it came up was because our labor force increased a little bit. So often people think, why would you ever want to see the unemployment rate rise? Isn't that bad? Not always. Sometimes it's good. It means there are more people entering the labor force than we were filling jobs. So that was a good increase. It is still very, very low. We are well below the US rate, which was at 3.9%. And in fact, if you look around the state, so there is some variation. If you think about the rim counties in the state, which is basically you follow the Canadian border around and you pick up Piscataquis County, those tend to have the higher unemployment rates. And then the coastal and the southern portions of the state have the lower unemployment rates. Even there, the highest unemployment rate in October was in Piscataquis County, and that was 3.7%. So still below the US. All of our counties were below the US. I will say that there is a seasonal pattern to these. So the county rates are not seasonally adjusted. We see them go up in the winter time and then come down in the summer. But they have been very, very low for quite some time now. If you look over at the far right, you can see the 1 year change. And in many cases, they're sort of at the same levels that they were a year ago, a little bit up, a little bit down in one county. So overall, very tight labor market conditions because we don't have a lot of people joining the labor force to start. We have that labor force declining because we have more of our population aging out. And we have a very, very low unemployment rate. There just aren't a lot of people sort of sitting on the sidelines trying to get into jobs. So there are not very many people available to take new jobs right now. That has an impact on our ability to actually grow the employment numbers for the state. In order to get new jobs, you need people to fill those jobs. So we did make it back to the pre-pandemic peak employment in summer of 2022. And then we've grown a little bit since then. For this calendar year 2023, we've been holding pretty steady. We came up a little bit in the most recent month. In October, we gained a few more jobs than we had been, but we've been holding pretty steady around 647,000 or so. And you can see the forecast here. This comes from the state's Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission. It's a group of 5 independent economists. They set the official economic forecast for the state. They meet a couple times a year. My office provides staff support to them. And then they turn over their economic forecast to the Revenue Forecasting Committee, which I sit on. And we do the official revenue forecast for the state, which in turn sets the state budget or what's available for the state budget. So this is the first step in that whole process. you can see that their forecast here has a little bit of growth, but for the most part, it's starting to plateau. And that's a reflection of the demographic situation. I will say that in their assumptions explicitly say that they're optimistic that we are going to continue to be able to see in-migration of working age populations. That's going to be a critical part of reaching this employment forecast because we need to have enough people moving in to offset the aging of that baby boom generation who are moving into retirement ages. So one of the things that happens when you have a very tight labor market is you see a lot of upward pressure on wages. So we have seen wages increase pretty sharply, particularly during the pandemic period. But it's interesting. So if you look at the blue line, that is average wage per job in current dollars. And you can see it looks like it's just it was increasing steadily, and then the pandemic hit and it started increasing faster. But if you adjust that for inflation, and you look at the orange line, we were actually just holding steady for a very, very long period of time. And then we started to see an upward movement pre-pandemic. That was because the labor market was really tight pre-pandemic. And so we were seeing upward pressure on wages before the pandemic hit. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a very sharp increase, and then inflation picked up. And now we're back, even though it still looks like wages are increasing really fast, they're just keeping pace with inflation. So what's been happening with inflation? The dark blue line here is all items consumer price index. It's a very broad measure of inflation. You can see that really rapid increase that happened from the depths of the pandemic in the very early days all the way up through June of 2022, when we finally saw inflation peak and start to come down. Now, I will point out, this is a year-over-year percent change. It is still positive. That means that we are still seeing price increases. Inflation is still going up. It is just not going up as fast as it was previously. So we have come down quite a ways. We're still up higher than the Fed would like to see, and we're up higher than we had been for the past decade or so pre-pandemic. If you look at the orangish line, that is core CPI. So that takes out the more volatile food and energy lines from all items. Those tend to have more up and down movements. So when you take them out, you get usually a smoother line. But even there, you can see a really rapid increase. It didn't get up quite as high. It has been coming down. That's an indication that inflation was more widespread than just food and energy. And in fact, most recently, the leading contributor to inflation has been that green dotted line, which is shelter. And so you can see, again, very, very rapid period of increase. It took longer to peak. And so it's only just now starting to come down. It is still very, very high. So the Federal Reserve Bank, of course, has been frantically trying to bring inflation down by raising interest rates. So their current target range is about 5.25% to 5.5%. If you look at the median projection for 2023 from their September meeting, that was 5.6%. So that implies that it's possible that there's going to be another rate increase later this year, 25 basis points, but maybe not. There's been a lot of discussion and guesses and are they going to, are they not going to? The markets at this point seem to be leaning towards they think that they're done raising interest rates. I don't know. I think anybody who does tell you that they know is probably wrong. But it is certainly reaching a point where they're slowing those rate increases. They're preparing to hold steady for a period of time. I think the larger question is, are they going to increase later this year or not before they reach that hold steady point? They're going to be looking at a lot of things that are going on with inflation, with employment, other parts of the economy to try to make that decision. If we look at the forecast for the Consumer Price Index, this again comes from the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission. You can see that annual rate for 2022, very, very high, 8%. 2023, about half that, or pretty close to 4%. And then their forecast has it coming down the next couple of years and then holding steady there, but still at an elevated rate. the folks on the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission, when they last met, and I should point out, so they last met at the end of October. So this is a November 1st forecast. It's relatively recent. They were not feeling terribly confident that we were going to see inflation come all the way back down to sort of that 2% level in their forecast period. So I've got a few things to wrap up with, and then I'm happy to open it up and take a few minutes of questions. So I wanted to talk again about housing. So I mentioned this at the beginning where we saw that really rapid increase in housing costs. We saw a lot of demand. We saw very limited supply. On top of that aspect of price increases, we also saw those interest rates drive mortgage rates up, which in turn meant that people who had lower rate mortgages wanted to stay there and not move to a higher rate mortgage, which means that that's even more inventory that's not going on the market. So all of this is really limiting the availability of housing for ongoing migration into the state and around the state, workforce expansion. If we're going to continue to attract people into the state, we need a place for them to live, and that is very challenging right now. So this continues to be a major issue and a major challenge to that ongoing migration. We have seen inflation start to slow. It's still high. The question really is the Fed going to raise rates again? I don't know. Are we going to continue to see migration into the state? In addition to the housing, which I just talked about a minute ago, I think that's one of the key determinants as to whether we continue to see migration into the state. I think another one is telework. So one of the reasons we saw so many people move into the state is because remote work availability was very widespread. People could keep their existing jobs, move to Maine, and not really have to change anything about their employment. As more companies have gone back to in-person or hybrid situations, some of those folks are going to be faced with the question of, do I need to move back because I now have to be within commuting distance of my office? Am I going to stay here and find a new job doing something else that I can do remotely, or shift to working for an in-state employer? But I think that question is sort of one of the factors, particularly for migration to some of the more rural parts of the state. If you're going to live there, you either need to find a job that's pretty local, or you need to have access to regular telework. And then the other thing that I want to mention is dependent care, and that's both childcare and then care for older adults and others who need dependent care. If you are trying to find a job and you're looking for a job somewhere else and you have dependents who are relying on you for care, you need to know that there's some sort of care available and that is affordable before you can make that move. And the affordability and availability are both a challenge on that front as well. I didn't say anything about recession earlier. I mean, if I'd been giving this presentation earlier in the year, I would have talked about, are we going to have a recession? Are we not going to have a recession? Economic uncertainty is still very, very high right now. There's geopolitical upheaval that is very challenging to sort of global economic stability. We've had student loan repayments resume very recently. That's going to be a toll on household budgets. And then we have ongoing federal budget challenges. No shutdown this month, but who knows what's going to happen in January. So those things are all levels of uncertainty that contribute to potential recession, slowdown, changes in economic conditions somewhere down the line. But on the good news side of this, the state does have a robust budget stabilization fund. That's the rainy day fund. It's actually at its statutory maximum right now. It's close to $970 million. That provides a good cushion if something does happen where the governor and the legislature won't have to make sudden cuts. They can continue to provide programs and services that are needed without having to make those sudden changes. And we still have spending from those pandemic era federal programs flowing out. In fact, there's a lot of infrastructure spending that is going to be starting next year. So a lot of, even though it feels like these programs are all over, a lot of that funding is still ongoing, and that will help provide some ongoing economic activity to the state. So that's what I have. I put our website on here. We publish a monthly economic indicators report. We've got some neat population projection demographic charts that I was talking about earlier. We've tried to publish our presentation slides there. So if you're looking for something and you can't find it, let me know. Or if you have questions down the line, feel free. You can send me an email, and I'm always happy to help if I can. So with that, I think I've got maybe 5 minutes for questions. Are there questions? Yes.
Are you aware of any studies that have been done about migration relative to climate change?
So that's a good, I've been getting a lot more questions the past 2 years or so about climate change migration. There's definitely a lot more interest in the topic. I haven't seen a lot of really good, robust studies yet. I think there's more research being done on that. Nothing yet at sort of the state level. Most of what I've seen has been talking at national, very high level, geographically. I suspect I will continue to see more research come out. There isn't anything out there yet that I could look at to sort of integrate into my population projections or something like that. But it's on my radar as an issue that keeps coming up. I think I saw.
Hi, Amanda.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Have you tracked what % of those in migration brought their jobs with them?
So we know very little about the folks who have moved in recently. Unfortunately, it's just there's not a lot of data out there. There is a study that's being undertaken by the Department of Economic and Community Development with an independent economist to do some surveys and do some studies of that population. And I'm really, really looking forward to getting the results from that, because that they're asking all, so they asked me what questions I wanted to ask. And so but they're asking all of the different questions that I could possibly want to know about that population. So I'm looking forward to getting some good information about that. At this point, essentially all we know is we know that they're younger. We know that there was an increase in remote workers in the state. If you look at Department of Labor's data, the businesses have to file with the unemployment insurance program if they have workers in the state, even if the business isn't located in the state. And so you see these out-of-state firms with all of a sudden, hey, I've got 1 worker, I've got 2 workers in Maine, things like that. So you can sort of infer that those are remote workers. And we did see an uptick in those during the pandemic. But that's just about all we know about them at this point until we get the results of that survey. Yes.
Good presentation, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, several weeks ago, there was an article in the Portland Press Herald dealing with a study, and I don't remember where the source of the study, that people in the state who are employed, 30% of those employed do not make enough to make ends meet for their living costs. And this was kind of reinforced last week. We had Joe Ryan, who's the head of the AIO, the food bank in Rockland. And he kind of reinforced that their traffic and the amount of food that they're giving out at the food bank is just going through the roof. It's an exponential increase. So I'm just wondering, is this something that your office tracks? Is there any concern about this?
So it's difficult to measure that. There isn't a source that sort of tracks at an individual level how many households can make ends meet or not. There isn't really an official definition of that. There are poverty line definitions, there are expanded poverty line definitions. Those don't necessarily balance both sides. Sometimes they're focused just on income, but they don't have a sense of what the expenses are. Sometimes you can see what the expenses are, but you don't have a sense of the income. We're sort of limited by those high level indicators. So certainly if you think about that really big increase in inflation, that is one of the things that contributes to some of those hardships. You can look at some data around poverty levels. There's a supplemental poverty level that takes into account government programs in addition to just income. During the pandemic, we saw that supplemental poverty level drop substantially because there were so many different programs. In particular, the expanded child tax credit that was going out brought childhood poverty levels down dramatically. When that program ended, we saw them just pop right back up again. But we don't have a good source for sort of what you're talking about, the sort of who's making ends meet and not. Yeah, I saw this hand. Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
In a situation where we have high labor force participation, low unemployment, and then that array of what I would call barriers for new immigration for work, we still see, or I do, numerous help wanted signs everywhere. And I'm wondering if there's any track with that population of employers as to why they aren't filling their jobs.
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the things that I was on a call with some university researchers earlier this week. It was yesterday, actually, talking about that phenomenon and whether there might be some additional research into that. You know, I will say that there's a measure that you can calculate where you look at the number of job openings and the number of persons who are unemployed. And if your ratio is above 1, then you have more unemployed persons per job opening. If you're below that, it's the other way around. We're at 0.4 right now. So we have basically 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed person, which is it's a reflection of just how tight the labor market is. Oftentimes there are skill set issues. So employers need a particular skill set, and in such a tight labor market, it's hard to find the person with that. It might be a geographic mismatch as well. Maybe there are workers with those skills, but they're just not in your location. There could be issues around, are the wage and benefit packages high enough for, you know, are you losing workers because somebody down the street or further afield with something comparable for work is offering better wages and benefits or a more flexible schedule. We don't have a ton of information on that. And that's one of the reasons we're talking about maybe we can do some more research into that particular area.
Amanda, many have called statistics and economics the dismal sciences.
Yes.
You've done a wonderful job of bringing them to life.
Oh, thank you.
I do have a question. Does the state assume that more population in the state of Maine is a positive thing or not?
So broadly speaking, I think I would say yes. I think that it's there with some caveats around that. But generally speaking, if we're looking to, for example, grow our labor force, we need to attract more people into the state to accomplish that. We can make a little bit of gains around the edges by improving the labor force participation of the people who are already here. And in some cases, you might be able to replace labor with technology or other solutions. But that we are going to need to continue to see some migration into the state. But I think there, you know, you get into some complicated questions about are there particular ages or skill sets that you need more than others? Do you really want all people? Or are you really talking about just working age people? And that those get into some very deep philosophical and political questions that I don't really want to get into, but certainly I think broadly speaking, there is a goal to continue to attract people into the state in order to accomplish some of those goals, particularly around labor force and employment.
A great presentation. The bad news is you got me fired up. There's so much that you said that just trying to figure out how to ask it in just one simple question, and that's not possible. The C story I have, which is something that's been kind of gnawing at me for 30, 40, 50 years as a citizen coming and going from the state of Maine, is the other day, it's a C story. The other day, I was talking to my brother-in-law who works for a construction company here in Maine, who happened to be in Austin, Texas, where they're building a semiconductor plant for Samsung. They right now have like 12,000 construction workers doing this thing. It's huge, massive. I'm not suggesting that that's what we do in Maine. So, but along those lines, I've always wondered, what are we doing for like quality innovation? Because now the governor has an innovation office, and are they using that information in connection with what you folks are trying to do and what you're trying to show what's going on here? I'm just kind of curious as to what are we doing to, do we baby boomers just need to get out of the way and let you folks do your work and get your quality of life going? And
I mean, I think our preference really would be that the baby boomers stay in the labor force a little bit longer to
Ah.
help out until we manage to get our labor force up in other ways. But so I will, there are many different things that I could talk about. I think what I want to talk about, just before the pandemic hit, the state released a brand new 10-year economic development strategy, rolled out in December of 2019. So literally just before the pandemic hit. One of the things that there were a couple of sort of large goals that were coming out of that. One related to talent pool attraction, one related to raising average wages per job, and one related to raising the value add per job. So essentially, how can we come up with some higher value add, more innovative things in our economy to generate some more new productivity, new creativity. So there are a lot of efforts that are underway that are trying to help accomplish that. And so I think that one of the things that we think about are what are some new and innovative things that we can do with our existing natural resources. So we've got a heck of a lot of trees in this state, rather than just like selling logs to somebody, or maybe you're making sort of really basic paper or something out of them. What are some things that we can do? And so there are all sorts of new innovative things that are being developed that are much higher value add products using all of the trees that we have. So that's sort of one very small example. But the Department of Economic Community Development does a lot of very detailed work with very specific niche companies that are developing some very high-tech, innovative kind of stuff. A lot of it is focused on just having a good environment to do work in. And then there are some specific things focused on helping to bolster those. But they would be able to speak in much more detail about the specific programs, rather than I have sort of just the large high view of what they're doing.
Good afternoon, Amanda.
Hi.
You and I have been in touch before. I'm David Grimer with the State of Maine Department of Labor.
Yes, good to see you again.
You too. So some excellent information. Gentleman in front of me wanted to know why there are so many help wanted signs. And you did refer in a small little way at the beginning of your presentation to the big factor, which is the one that explains so much to a lot of people. The state of Maine, you said, it's easier to die. It's easier to die than to be born. Is essentially what you said. You did not, for a moment, put it in those terms. However,
Glad you clarified that.
however, it's what's happening. Our birth rate does not even replace us, is what we're basically saying.
Yeah.
It's low. And this is why, and you have to bear in mind it takes 16 to 18 years to make one worker. Okay. 16 to 18 years ago, there weren't enough children being born to take all the jobs who are available today. And that has been true for years and years and years and years and years. So we're familiar, the Department of Labor, with the fact that more workers are leaving the labor market on the far end of the conveyor belt, as it were, to retire or to move on. And very few are being put on the conveyor belt at the beginning of its cycle. Now that's Maine. And I saw something the other day saying that the Vermont Labor Commissioner was saying, it's the same here. He said, we're starting to call it the Gray Mountain State. So if not enough kids being born is such a huge impact, I'm getting the impression that it's the same nationwide on the whole. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So that, we are used to sort of thinking about this here in Maine because we've been dealing with this for quite a few years now. But it isn't just Maine. This is a factor in the US, in particular in the Northeast. I think it was a New York Times article that was about Vermont, and I was delighted to see that it was about Vermont because it wasn't about Maine, which is what it almost always is. But it's becoming a growing factor in other parts of the US. Certainly there are other countries globally that have been dealing with this even longer than Maine has. And it really is, I think, for the US, there are a lot of states where the pandemic was sort of an eye-opener. The fact that a lot of states all of a sudden saw their median ages increase, which is not something that they were sort of used to seeing. They saw population growth slow. They've seen this start to happen. And I think they're maybe panicking a little bit where we're like, well, we've to some extent figured it out. We know that we still need to do more. We know we still need to bring more younger folks into the state. But we got back to that pre-pandemic employment level with a much smaller labor force than we had previously. That's pretty impressive. There are a lot of things that we've sort of figured out and cobbled together over the years where I think we can be an example to a lot of other states that are starting to deal with this now. But it does mean that we have this increasing competition for those working age folks that are out there, because we're not the only ones who want them to move here. Vermont wants them too, and New Hampshire and Massachusetts and lots of other places. So we need to try to figure out what we can do to help smooth the road as much as possible to make sure that Maine is where they decide to be instead of Vermont.
And there's just not enough to go around, right?
Basically, yeah. Yep.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
And
It's my
maybe
pleasure.
Sure. Yep. Want to continue the conversation in a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, how about the raffle?
The raffle, some easier numbers to work with. $601 if you have the winning ticket, and then you pull the Queen of Hearts. Jared, give us the odds. No?